Okay, hello everyone. My name is Eric Maslowski, and in this tutorial we're going to be continuing the one-on-one series for 3D Studio Max by taking a look at rendering. More specifically, we're going to be taking a look at how we can render still images as well as animations, save them to disk, change their resolution, change their timing, and so forth with the scanline renderer. Now for Mental Ray, we'll take a look at many of these options and how they apply to Mental Ray in the Mental Ray introduction tutorial. Okay, so let's get started. If you load up the file that came with this tutorial, you'll see that we have a very simple scene. We have a couple cups, a couple plates, table, and tablecloth. Okay, so the easiest way to render a scene in 3D Studio Max right off the bat is to just press F9 on your keyboard. Now, one thing to keep in mind though is when you do so, it will render whichever viewport you have active. So in this case, we want Cam Near to be our viewport. Now you can see the line, that's basically the progress of the renderer. And here we go. So this is the image it generated with the shadows and so forth. So let's take a look at this window that I actually brought up. Okay, this is your render frame window. And if you right click in your image, you'll see that we can sample any pixel and get information about that pixel. We can get its location, we can get the color, we can get, how much it contributes to the alpha, the mono, red, green, blue. And if we choose to render out various aspects such as Z depth, object ID, velocity, whatever, we can get information about that pixel too. Now you'll also notice at the top of the screen, when I right click, it samples the color underneath my cursor as well. Now we can use this to easily copy that color and then paste it into any other color swatch in 3D Studio Max, such as a background color, material color, object color, whatever. Okay, so now let's take a look at the top here. The first option here is Save icon. Okay, so this will save this image that we just created. So our first option here is, I'm just going to call it Test 01. And if we click on the drop-down list for the Save As type, we can take a look at a couple of the different formats that Max supports. We have AVI files, which support basically any codec you have installed. You can do HDR, or high dynamic range images. You can do OpenEXR, which is a little bit more elaborate version of HDR. Then you have QuickTime Movies. Again, it's based off of any codec that you have set. Then you can also do RPF formats. Now RPF allows you to specify all of these different channels, all this extra, supplementary information. You can then take this RPF format and bring it directly into packages like Combustion and use this information, such as the depth, to do some really nice motion blur or fog effects, or just do some really cool compositing tricks. So what we're going to do in this case is we're just going to use our JPEG, and we'll click Save, Overwrite. Now whenever you choose a format or a different format to save as, it'll bring up the configuration options for that particular format. So if we chose AVI, instead of seeing these settings right here, we'll see all the settings for choosing a codec, compression settings, and so on. But in this case, we are just getting the JPEG configuration options. So we'll just click OK, and we'll now have that image on our desktop. Here we go. Okay, so now next from that is a clone button. And what this does is it just creates a copy of your window, useful for comparing images. Next to that are individual channels. Okay, so we got a red, green, and blue. Next to those we have our alpha channel. Then comes monochrome. So if you just want to see a quick black and white image of your rendering. Following that is the clear option, which will clear the entire window. And then we have the drop-down list. Now if we chose to render out any of that extra information, such as object ID, velocity, and so on, we would see it in this drop-down list right here. Okay, so let's close this down and take a look at a couple other options. Now, we've been using the F9 key to render our scene. If we actually move our toolbar over to the left till we see two teapots, we can also click on the solo teapot to get the same effect as F9. So you can access the same functionality in two ways here. Now, to the left of that are actually our rendering options. So this is where we'll specify all our resolution, our timing, and our output files. So if we click on the teapot with the box next to it, or press F10 on the keyboard, we get this big dialog box. Now, at the very top here is our time output. Okay, so it's currently set to single, and that basically means that it's only going to render out a single frame. We can choose the active time segment, which is this area represented in our timeline, or we can choose a specific range or specific frames. Now, since we only have a static image here, we're going to keep it at single. Next down from there are our resolution or our output size. Currently we have some, bizarre resolutions. These are pretty common, 320 by 240, 640 by 480. These are options that I typically like to use for large print resolution and a smaller version of that. Now, what we can do though is we can actually configure these to be whatever we want. So say we want another very common resolution, computer resolution, 1024 by 768. So once we do that, you can see that it gives us our image aspect ratio, our pixel aspect, and our aperture. We can now right click on any one of these buttons. We can explicitly set it here, or we can just say get current settings. Once we click OK, it then saves it right there. So we can store 4 custom resolutions or commonly used resolutions. However, if we're going to a very standard medium, such as television, HDTV, or even going out to IMAX, we can click on this drop-down list to get an idea of all the different presets that come with Max. So we got a bunch of 35 millimeters, the IMAX, NTSC, HDTV, and so on. So if we click on, let's say, HDTV, you can see that all of these options on the right here changed to standard HDTV settings. And then these are usually just a portion of this, so that you can get a really small, quick rendering instead of always having to go full resolution. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to jump back up to custom, and we're just going to choose 320 by 240 just to speed up our renderings. Now underneath that are our options. Our options allow us to turn on and off various features like atmospherics, effects, and displacements. Atmospherics are just things like fog, glare, and so on, or effects are more like glare. And then you can also do video color check, where it will place in a color if your image doesn't correspond to video standards. You can render out the fields if you want, which are interlaced lines, and so on and so forth. Further on down from there is advanced lighting. If you're using something like global illumination, this is where you want to make sure you have it activated. Next we have rendering output. This is where we can choose where 3D Studio Max will render our files to. So if we click on files, we get that same dialog box that we had when we clicked on the little save icon. So what we'll do is we'll just make our way up to our desktop and choose test 01, click Save, gives us our options. There we go. Now underneath here we have such things as rendered frame window, which is that window that popped up when we rendered. We can skip existing images, so if it detects that an image already exists there, it won't do anything. It'll fail to render. And then we also have network rendering option right here, which is actually very nice in 3D Studio Max. You can just click on this, it brings up a nice window where you choose what computers you want to send it to, click submit, and that's it. So it's very nice, nicely integrated, very easy to use. Okay, and then finally, down here at the bottom you can see what it's going to render. If I click on this drop down list, you can see that it actually only has my viewports, and that's the way it's always going to be. So you can only render out to one of your viewports. If, say, you have a camera that's hidden in the scene and you want to render to it, but it doesn't represent one of these viewports, you have to convert one of these viewports over to that camera before you can render it. Okay, and then we can click render right down here. It asks us if we want to overwrite. Click yes, and there we go. We can go up to File, View Image File. Here's our image, and exactly as we expect. Okay, so that is a really quick overview of the basic scanline rendering options dialog. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at rendering an animation. Very similar, slight difference, especially with timing and the output format. Okay, so if we switch to Camera Near, right click on it, go to Views, and choose Camera Animation. So you can see here I have a very, very simple animation. Just moving right in, and then ping-ponging right back. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to render this animation out. So if we go back up to our render options by hitting F10 or the teapot with the box next to it, we no longer want single. We want to render out a sequence of frames or a sequence of images. We can choose active time segment and it'll render out 0 to 300 in this case, or we can render out a specific range. So let's do this to start with. So we'll just do from 0 to 20, just to keep time short. Okay, then we're going to choose our resolution. Now again, just to keep time short, we're going to change our resolution to half of what it was. Now you may have noticed that I changed both independently, both resolutions independently. But say I want to keep the same aspect ratio as this 320 by 240, but don't want to do the math to break it up. So for example, say this one over here, the 3000 by 43 by 43. If I wanted to do this in half, this is a little bit more complex math down here at the bottom. So what I can do is I can just turn on lock image aspect ratio, and then just change whatever one that I want. And then there you go. So in this case, we're going to go to 320. We're going to set this to 160. The other one automatically gets set to 120. And we're going to take a look at our rendering output. Now, if we're rendering out a sequence of images and we choose an image format, such as JPEG, Targa, bitmap, whatever, what 3D Studio Max will do is it'll create an image for each frame in that sequence. If we wanted to treat it like one complete movie, we have to choose a movie format, such as AVI or QuickTime file. So in this case, I'm going to go with QuickTime. Click on Save. I'm going to just keep these settings and make sure I'm at the right viewport, then click Render. Okay, and so there it goes. Just finished it. And so let's take a really quick look at what we have here. Okay, there's our very simple small animation. So let's take another look at what was actually happening and take a look at the window that popped up during the render. So for this, we're just going to give ourselves a little bit more time. I'm going to click on render. Okay, so you can see that it's rendering over here on the right hand side. The very top here is just how much of the total animation is done, how much of the current frame is done. Now you can see in the next section that current frame took less than a second, the elapsed time is slowly increasing, and the time remaining is purely an estimate. Don't put too much faith in this time remaining, because sometimes in very, very complex scenes, what it'll do is it'll just take a look at how long the last render frame took. So say your first frame in your animation takes 15 minutes to render. You'll be using that as an estimate for the rest of the animation. Now as your times go down, so say frame 30 on only take a second, it will then gradually refine its estimation, but that initial value is usually a bit exaggerated for real world scenes. Then on the left hand side here you can see what frame it's on, if there's multiple passes. We have our render settings, so our resolution, aspect ratio, and all our different options. We have what we're outputting here, scene statistics, so we can see how many objects, how many lights, how many faces, how much memory we're using, and then just some general information about the scanline renderer itself. Okay, so I'm just going to cancel this and close that down. Okay, so that is basically, how you can render things out in 3D Studio Max. In future tutorials, we'll be going over more information such as, all the specific rendering options such as anti-aliasing, SSE optimizations, as well as mental ray, and potentially even Brazil if there's an interest for it. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me or post on the forums.